Okay, we're about to go live here. Hello, my name is Stacy Brown. On behalf of the Augusta Memorial Public Library, Badger Talks, and the Wisconsin Science Festival, welcome to tonight's program, Does Brain Training Really Work? Presented by Dr. C. Sean Green, a professor at UW-Madison's College of Letters and Science in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Green received his BA, MA, and PhD in Brain and Cognitive Sciences from the University of Rochester. He then completed postdoctoral training in computer vision and machine learning at the University of Minnesota before joining the psychology faculty at UW-Madison in 2011. His research focuses on how to improve individuals' perceptual and cognitive skills both via purposefully designed training regimens as well as commercial off-the-shelf video games. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Green.
So thank you so much for having me here virtually. I'm very kind of hopeful that get to start doing Badger Talks in person. I'm a transplant to Wisconsin, but kind of loved it as soon as I moved here, and I've really missed kind of going around to different parts of the state, mainly because I go to at least one supper club, if not two, for every trip. So hopefully that will be on the agenda soon, but happy to join you here via live stream. And going to talk to you tonight about brain training. This is an area that's kind of a big area of active research in the scientific community, and obviously something that everyone in the general population, or many people in the general population, are interested in. Many people, just being online today, you're constantly exposed to pretty strong claims about various brain training products. I keep seeing this one. I happen to play online euchre with friends, and so I constantly see this one game neuroscientists are begging people over the age of 40 to play, which always makes me giggle a little bit, in that I know lots of neuroscientists and they've really never begged anyone to play anything. Kind of go around online, constantly see ads for brain trainers like Lumosity, for instance. Lots of strong claims out there. The ads kind of indicate really big kind of effects. On the other hand, many of you have probably seen newspaper reports, for instance, where the evidence doesn't always seem like it's matched the claims. So several years back, for instance, the Federal Trade Commission fined Lumosity for making claims that didn't match the strength of the evidence that they had. And so this could be a really difficult space to navigate. You've got some very, very strong claims by companies. The scientific literature, can be kind of very intimidating to work through. And so I'm going to hope to kind of give you a big picture of what the science looks like right now, and what I would recommend, say, for my own parents, in this space, or what I do recommend for my own parents in this space. So obviously, as I said, lots and lots of interest in this topic. I just did like Google search for does brain training really work? This is something people are interested in. As I said, it's kind of hard to navigate. And so I'm going to go through kind of this in a pretty orderly fashion. I'm going to start with what is cognitive training? And really the transition from saying brain training to cognitive training is pretty deliberate. Partially, many people who are research scientists, myself, like myself, almost treat the term brain training as a pejorative. The space had just been inundated by companies that weren't always doing good faith science. So often we'll use the term cognitive training rather than brain training. Why has there been a surge of interest in cognitive training? This is something that kind of has really taken off over the last, say, 15 years. When I started graduate school, for instance, there wasn't really this same kind of active engagement either in the scientific community or amongst the general population. What are the major obstacles to successful cognitive training? In practice, it's not easy to create something that matches the types of claims that are made, or really the type of outcomes that we would like as scientists to produce. And so I think giving an intuition for what makes it difficult and what type of obstacles need to be overcome is useful in thinking about, well, what types of things would people want to engage with? And then we'll start talking about the evidence. So I'll talk about evidence suggesting that cognitive training can be beneficial, and also talk about counter evidence. This is a case where I think, talking through what the literature actually says. I think anyone in this space who makes incredibly strong claims probably just isn't doing things in good faith. In practice, as you'll see, there's competing lines of evidence. And so sorting through what the competing lines of evidence and what type of inferences we should make, try to kind of walk through that. And then finally, where does that leave us? What are the types of suggestions? For instance, if someone is aging, my parents are in their mid-60s, what type of suggestions might I give? So first, what is cognitive training? Or, if we want to use the term brain training. And really, the first thing I try to impart is that cognitive training isn't one single thing. Oftentimes, when people say do a Google search, they'll search for, does brain training really work? Or, I'll get asked, does brain training work? Even the title of my talk was this. But it is useful to consider that this isn't one thing. There's obviously lots and lots and lots of products that are available. Some of them are free apps, some of them are for pay. Almost none of them are exactly the same. Actually, none of them are exactly the same, and many of them are actually quite different from one another. And so despite the fact that we might use the term brain training for all of these, they actually represent pretty different experiences. And as we'll see, it's really the experience that's going to determine what the impact of the training is. And so the fact that these are all different in terms of experience means that the expectation should be that they have a variety of different impact. In addition to the products, lots of the basic science, doesn't necessarily involve some of the, the brain training apps that you might see advertisements for. So as mentioned in the introduction, some of the research in my lab actually looks at the cognitive impact of playing not brain training products, but just commercial off-the-shelf video games. Like in the top left here. What is the impact on cognitive health of just playing regular commercial games rather than games that have been designed with the goal of producing impact? All the way down to oftentimes the basic science uses much simpler types of training tasks. Ones that just involve very simple letters and shapes where we can start to try to isolate the mechanisms through which we might be able to improve cognitive function. And even in some parts of the space, and I'll get to this all the way at the end, the types of things that people will call cognitive training can even expand beyond, things that you say look at on a computer screen. Something like, walking every day or getting aerobic exercise. And so at the very, very end of the talk, I'll kind of walk through some of the evidence that suggests that aerobic activity can be really beneficial for cognitive health. Really kind of reflecting the idea that body and mind are really strongly connected. And so improving the health of the body can certainly improve the health of the mind and cognitive functioning. And so really this question of whether cognitive training or brain training works is ill-posed. There's not a single unique answer to it. And often the analogy that I'll use is, in the same way you can't ask if dieting works. There's lots and lots of types of diets. They'll have kind of the same broad goal, but they can differ substantially in terms of, what food someone eats, how much of that food they eat, when they eat that food. And the kind of final impact on the body is going to depend on all of those factors. Very similar with brain training. What types of tasks do they have you do? How often do they have you do them? How many different tasks are there that you do daily? All those things will matter. The other reason I think dieting is actually a pretty good analogy, and it's something that I won't be able to get into today, is that there are pretty substantial kind of individual differences. And so this is something that as scientists, we're just now beginning to explore. There's reason to think, so what I'm going to talk to you today about is kind of the global findings, what's the average outcome? But obviously, human beings kind of vary along lots of different continua. And so there's at least reason to suspect that individual people would respond better or worse to certain types of experiences. And so that's at least a direction that the science is heading. We're not remotely there yet. So I'm really going to just talk through what's the average finding regarding some of these training products. All of these things together, though, the fact that there's not just one, product, all of these things are different. They matter in terms of how they're different, makes the job of a consumer way more difficult. And so I'm at least going to talk through at the end of the talk some things that you can look for, if you're thinking about using some of these things. So next, why the surge in cognitive training? Again, as said, this is really something, if you actually look at, say, the scientific literature on cognitive training, it's kind of a massive increase starting in the late 2000s, early 2010s. It's really continued on today. So why was that a particularly kind of auspicious time for this research to start? Well, one is kind of an advancing understanding, scientific understanding of neuroplasticity. So for a very long time, the field of neuroscience kind of had the belief that as human beings age, the brain got progressively more rigid, right? You may have heard the adage, can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so there was some belief that as human beings aged, they basically became less and less plastic, less and less able to learn, less and less able to adapt. And while there's some truth to that, so for instance, young kids are just incredibly adaptive. Their brains are very plastic, very capable of responding to new experiences. Evidence from neuroscience over the last 20 some odd years has shown that human beings still retain really significant neuroplasticity, even into pretty old age, suggesting that they still retain the capacity to, say, respond well to various types of training. Another is kind of the obvious cognitive decline that often comes with aging in concert with the fact that we have a aging population. So the baby boomer generation is starting to get into their 50s, 60s, 70s. And this is a time when there starts to be fall off in lots of cognitive abilities. There tends to be a very kind of natural decline that occurs with aging that frankly starts early on. People hit their maximum in different types of abilities at different ages, but often this is in early to mid 20s, and there's kind of usually a pretty steady decline beyond that sometimes accelerates even a little bit more dramatically once people get into their 60s and 70s. So on this graph here, just lots of different abilities, whether it's kind of the ability to maintain spatial orientation, to process perceptual information quickly, to remember things that are spoken verbally. So just to remember lists of things, lots and lots of those tend to just naturally fall off. There's a few things that don't really fall off very much as people age. So for instance, people's vocabulary doesn't really change very much as they age, but most cognitive functions undergo some amount of slowing just as people age. And so those two things definitely created, a substrate. We know that older adults have the capacity to show neuroplastic change. There's need for it. We have an aging population. And then the final bit that I think was important was not just the rise of video games, but the rise of ease of use. Basically, the fact that people had devices at their fingertips that could deliver various types of cognitive training very easily. And so just on this graph is kind of the history of video games going back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, most of the games were on arcades. People had to go to an arcade to play things like Pac-Man or Space Invaders. As we moved into the mid 80s, we start to see consoles like Nintendo. We start to see PC games kind of come into the space. And then really in the kind of mid 2000s to late 2000s to early 2010s, we see a strong rise in the mobile space where people start to have devices in their hands or in their pockets that could kind of provide pretty cognitively engaging experiences. And so, all of these things together, we have kind of clear need, we have evidence that there is neuroplasticity, and we actually have a substrate that we can deliver some of this training. All together have conspired to really push this as a research domain, and in turn as a commercial venture. So what are the obstacles? There's lots of enthusiasm for cognitive training. Why is this difficult? And one of the major reasons that this is difficult is what we're going to call specificity of learning. And to give you an idea of what specificity of learning, it's worth first starting with the fact that human beings are good at learning new tasks. If you sit someone down at some kind of visual task or some kind of cognitive task and just have them do it over and over and over and over again, they will tend to get better at it through time. So this is a very classic example. So as in the intro, some of the work in my lab is on human vision. So this is a very classic example from human visual learning. It's conceptually a super simple task. It's called the Vernier acuity task. You just present participants with these two lines, one on top of the other, and you ask them, is the line on top offset to the left or to the right of the line on the bottom? And so on this screen here, it's kind of trivially easy to see that it's offset to the right, but you can kind of make this arbitrarily difficult. So in this case, the answer is offset to the right. Many of you can actually probably see this. I think it's offset like 1 pixel to the right, but human vision is quite good. And if you give people just repeated practice at this, you just have them do this line task over and over and over again. You make the line offset to the right or to the left by tinier and tinier and tinier amounts. People will get better at this through time. And so on this little plot here, the y-axis is just how good they are. It's basically how tiny an offset can they identify. So lower on this graph is better. It means that they can progressively identify smaller and smaller little offsets. And the x-axis is just time. So through time, they're getting better. They can identify smaller and smaller offsets. I like this as an example because it happens to have a Guinness Book of World Records. It's held by the dean of the School of Optometry at UC Berkeley. He was at the University of Houston at the time, and just using this task as part of his research quite a bit, got incredibly good at it just based on the sheer number of times that he had done this task. And so the world record, it's 0.85 seconds of arc. And so 1 second of arc, so 1 degree is about the width of your pinky nail if you hold it at arm's length. So there'd be 360 of those all around you. 1 minute of arc is 1/60th of a degree, and 1 second is 1/60th of a minute. So if you can imagine holding your pinky nail out at arm's length and then dividing it into 360 even spaces, that's the level that you could learn to actually detect this offset. It's about the width of a pencil if you're viewing it at the distance of a mile. So people can get kind of outlandishly good at tasks if you give them enough dedicated practice at those tasks. The problem is that often they only get better at exactly what they've practiced. So if we take this vertical line task, and then we do something that seems really simple, we'll just change the lines to horizontal. So we haven't really done anything too interesting. We've just taken the vertical lines and we flipped them so they're horizontal. So now your job is to say whether one of the lines is above or below the other one. What we see happens is basically the participants who had got really, really good at the vertical task, they go right back to where they started with the horizontal task. And so we call this failure of transfer. All of this learning that happened with the vertical task basically provided no benefit when we made this really minor change. We just made things horizontal. It's the same lines. And so this phenomenon, this specificity of learning, shows up throughout the learning sciences. So there's kind of very classic work. People got very excited about chess, for instance, for a while as a way to say train memory and cognitive function. There was a finding that, if you quickly showed chess grandmasters and people with no chess experience at chessboard, the chess grandmasters could remember like 93% of the pieces, whereas the people with no chess experience could only correctly place, say a quarter of them. Sometimes they could only replace 3 or 4 of the pieces. What was subsequently found, though, is if you just randomize where the pieces are, all of that benefit from the chess grandmasters went away. They looked just like novices. Really what they had learned is to quickly memorize chess pieces when they're in a configuration that looks like a chess game. Obviously, there are kind of ways in which chess games progress. And so there are kind of combinations of pieces that are typical. Chess grandmasters can take advantage of that very specific chess knowledge. Remember where lots of pieces are. If you just plop them down randomly, though, they don't actually have any better memory than someone who hasn't done any chess at all. And so sometimes we'll call this the curse of specificity, because of the fact that it's a real obstacle for any real world good. It's important for us, if we're going to design a training paradigm to increase people's cognitive function, they can't just be good at the one little task that we give them in the lab or the one little task that they work on their phone. They have to show benefits on real tasks out in the real world. It doesn't really do anyone much good if they get incredibly good at, say, playing Sudoku. If they can't then plan out, their trip through say a shopping mall or through the supermarket. It doesn't do, say, an elderly driver much good if they get really, really good at detecting a little flashing light, in a certain position on their iPad and a visual trainer, but then they can't detect a car that's coming in an intersection. Really, the benefits need to be broad, and it's that aspect that makes cognitive training hard. It's easy to make people good at individual tasks. It's hard to kind of make them globally good at tasks. And so what's the evidence that suggests that this can be done, that suggests that cognitive training can in fact be beneficial? So I'm going to go through just a couple of examples. This is a giant scientific literature, so I just want to give you a flavor for the types of studies that people have done. So one study is called the impact study. And so in this particular training study, and as is commonly the case, the participants were asked to do a lot of different types of tasks. Some of them were auditory. So for instance, just hearing sweeps of different frequencies and saying whether the frequencies are going up or down. Some of them were specifically about kind of speech relevant sounds. And there's reason to use speech relevant sounds, especially in individuals that are aging. Some of them are related to memory. Some of the tasks are kind of more about comprehension. And so this is a pretty common flavor of cognitive training, where in practice, what it is isn't just one thing. It's lots and lots of separate things. So here, people were trained on 6 different tasks. It wasn't just one task. And one of the reasons that people do this is to try to overcome this specificity, with the idea that if we train you on lots of different things, it should broaden the horizons of the impact than if we just train you on the one thing where all you get better is that one task. And so this particular trial led to pretty significant impact. So this is the experimental group on training on this task. It was a memory measure. So this was their performance at pre-test, performance at post-test. So performance went up. And this is an active control group. And so this is actually an important, an important detail about how these studies are run. So just in the same way that, say, a pharmaceutical trial, will compare the impact of a real drug with some type of control. So for instance, we want to know whether or not this newly developed drug produces stronger analgesia, so reduction of pain, than a control. So maybe the real drug is a little white pill, and then the control is an identical white pill that's actually a sugar pill. Should have no impact at all. And so we do something very similar in the cognitive training field. We compare, say, a real type of training, one that we think is going to have impact, with some other type of experience that people will have. Ideally, one that the participants who are doing it believe might lead to some impact, but for which we have reason to think won't actually lead to any cognitive changes. And so really the comparison that we're making is, does the training that we think is cognitively enhancing lead to more enhancement than just some type of control group? And so that was the case with this impact study on lots of different dimensions. So this is overall memory, This is processing speed. So lots of the decline that occurs in cognitive aging can be tracked back to just kind of slower processing. And so increasing the rate at which people are kind of doing mental computations can have lots of wide-ranging benefits. And so this particular study saw improvements there. So this is a score where down is better. You're processing more quickly. And so the group that trained on these 6 tasks showed an increase in processing speed, a decrease in reaction time, whereas the control group didn't really change at all. So there's kind of a pretty big body of research. The tasks themselves differ from research group to research group, but lots of research using the same type of approach where there's several different, tasks that people train on daily. Another approach that people have been increasingly taking is trying to kind of combine certain types of psychological processing with video games. And so this was a game, Neuroracer, developed by a research group at the University of California, San Francisco, that was designed to enhance cognitive processing, again, in older adults. This is actually a kind of interesting example of a game where lots of the ideas around games for cognitive training involve putting people under what we would call sustained load. Basically, it's hard for them. And so one thing that's really notable in the space of video games is that the type of games that are difficult, say for an 18-year-old, this isn't going to be a surprise for most people listening, are not the same as the games that are difficult for, say, a 65-year-old. And so this game, Neuroracer, where you're just kind of driving this car on this little strip, not particularly difficult for 18-year-olds, but for the participants in the study, who were much older adults, pretty challenging. And so in this particular study, what they started with is just asking how good are people at this task across the lifespan? Generally speaking, if this is a good model of type of task where we see cognitive decline, well, we should see this. If we test people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s to 70s, we should see that people who are 70 are doing way worse at this task than people who are 20. Absolutely see that this is true. So 0 on this axis is actually the best possible performance. So even people in their 20s aren't perfect at it, but there's a big fall off through time as people get into their 70s. And then what the group then did is have people in their 70s just play this game a lot. This game actually has quite a lot of variety. It actually has multiple different components in it, or the more difficult version of this game has multiple things that you need to do simultaneously. You need to be monitoring for a stoplight while still steering appropriately. And so they trained people on this game and then asked, well, what do they look like on this axis? And so really the 2 lines to look at or to worry about here are the red line. So the red line are people who were in their 70s, who didn't play the game at all. And so they just continue to look like regular 70-year-olds. The blue line was first the people at pre-test before they had played the game. They look pretty much like normal 70-year-olds. They then played the game for, many hours spaced out over several weeks. They actually kind of on this version go to look more like 20-year-olds. And then one thing that this group did is then ask, well, all right, so they played this for multiple hours. We see some big improvements in cognitive function. And then they're going to stop playing the game. How much of that do they keep? Kind of skill acquisition always falls off through time, right? If you think of things that, you've practiced a lot, and then you don't do it for, say, a decade, well, you always get worse at it through time. And that's the case in kind of any kind of cognitive thing as well. But here, lots of the benefit that they saw right after training actually continued to persist 6 months later. And so this is actually another pretty fundamental obstacle that needs to be faced, is not just how do we produce broad impact in cognitive function, but how do we keep it broad and keep it from falling off through time, especially if people stop engaging with the products. And so finally, one more example that's in the same space. And the reason I like this is just like in the first example, this particular research group had people do various, multiple types of tasks. But they actually split it out by tasks that really loaded on memory. So one group really kind of worked on tasks that involve memory. One group really trained on a series of tasks that involved reasoning and higher order cognition. One group trained on a series of tasks that really involved kind of speed, going quicker and quicker. And so really what's the dominant finding there is that, well, if you practice memory things, you're kind of better at things that involve memory. And maybe not just the things that you practiced, but you don't see any benefit for things like reasoning or speed. Same kind of thing happens if you practice things that involve reasoning. You get better at other tasks that involve reasoning, but not necessarily things that involve memory or things that involve speed. Same phenomenon for speed. And so this is just another nice data point that suggests, well, maybe the kind of only way that we can overcome this curse of specificity is to provide lots and lots of variety of experience. Anytime you do too much of the same task over and over and over and over again, you'll tend to get good at that one task, but it won't extend to other things in your life. And so those are just kind of three kind of examples of studies. Generally speaking, when we want to know kind of broad questions, like, is it possible to enhance cognitive function through dedicated training? We'll do what's called meta-analysis, where what we do is we search the literature for all of the different research groups that have asked the same question or a similar question. Can some type of dedicated behavioral training enhance some type of cognitive function? And we'll aggregate over all those individual studies. Any individual study has some kind of details, right? If I do a study at the University of Wisconsin, often it's in participants from Madison. In lots of ways, the people of Madison are representative of people throughout the United States and throughout the world. In other ways, they're not particularly representative of people in kind of other parts of the United States or other parts of the world. And so any study that I do in Wisconsin, we think probably holds in other parts of the world. But we've become more confident if we then say, oh, yes, this group that was in Germany did a similar study, saw similar effects. This group that is in South Korea did a similar study, saw similar impact. This group in Japan, and so forth. And so we call this meta-analysis, where we aggregate over lots and lots of different studies. And so this is an example of a meta-analysis. And so on this plot, 0 would mean that the group that got the real cognitive intervention, and the group that got the control, the thing that we think wouldn't do anything, 0 would mean that they were exactly the same. Basically, it's that there was no effect of the cognitive training. Anything to the right would mean that the group that got the real cognitive training showed some benefits beyond just what the control experienced. And anything on the left would mean the opposite. The control group got benefits not seen by the cognitive training group. And so you can see here, basically, almost all of these studies are somewhere to the right of 0, suggesting that there's some benefit. Some of them are very, very large. Some of them are pretty close to 0. But across all of these different studies, generally speaking, there's some benefit seen of behavioral training. And so we usually put it in terms of standard deviations of improvement. So it's about what we call an effect size of 0.5, which is something that is meaningful in real life. It would be kind of a clinically useful amount of improvement. So this particular meta-analysis was specifically in healthy older people. There's similar meta-analyses in kind of younger adult populations. So lots of the basic science that we do uses younger adult populations. And so again, this graph works exactly the same way. And so again, most of the stuff tends to be over towards the right. Some things are kind of at 0. Some things are just a little bit on the right side of 0. Some are actually even on the left side of 0. But across all the different studies tends to be a general positive finding. And so that tends to give us a lot more confidence in the effect when we know lots of different groups who have done this in slightly different ways have all seen a generally positive outcome. It's much stronger evidence than just one study. And this is even a graph from my own work. So this is no longer kind of cognitive training, but this is actually playing very demanding commercial video games. And so these graphs work exactly the same way. We've separated out according to various types of cognitive abilities, whether it's perception or bottom-up attention. None of that is particularly important for the purposes of this talk. What's important for the purposes of this talk is that by and large, playing these types of pretty demanding commercial off-the-shelf games seems to have pretty significant cognitive impact, with one really primary exception is actually in older adults. So young adults, for instance, show pretty significant benefits, and actually so do children. Older adults tend not to show really any benefit of playing this game at all, which actually goes back to the point I made earlier about matching kind of the demands of the cognitive training to the capacity of the individuals. By and large, commercial game developers are not making games to be played by people in their mid-60s to 70s to 80s. They're just too difficult. And so because they're too difficult, not really much impact of them. But amongst kind of younger adults, just playing commercial video games seems to have roughly the same positive impact on on cognitive function as any of the kind of more dedicated products or interventions. So that's the evidence suggesting that cognitive training can be beneficial. But as I said, kind of anyone who makes the claim that all the evidence is on one side and that there's no counter evidence just is not making a good faith argument. There's a little bit of what's the quote from Shakespeare? The lady doth protest too much, methinks. Right? Any kind of organization or product website that's claiming all the evidence is positive just isn't being honest, I would say. And so there is absolutely counter evidence, evidence that suggests that there's much smaller to no impact. So for instance, this here was a study that was done in the UK. It was a researcher, Adrian Owen, in concert with his research group, and with a well-known British television program. I am completely not remembering the name of the program, but it's kind of, pop science. Where what they did is they actually recruited people who were kind of avid watchers of the show and asked them to kind of do some of these kind of little brain games. You may, if any of you have ever engaged with any of these products, may have seen things that look like this. There's little puzzles to solve. There's, mathematics equations. There's basically the memory game, right, where you turn over cards and try to match them, that are kind of dressed up in a loose veneer of video games. Actually, sometimes those of us who study commercial games, we refer to these as chocolate-covered broccoli, because in practice, playing the kid's memory game, not always that fun for an adult. And even if you try to stick a little video game shell on it, still not really that fun. But these are pretty standard types of tasks that you might see in some of the products that are sold online or in various app stores. So they had their kind of viewers play these games and then ask, did it produce improvements in things like memory? Or so here's one specific game, we won't worry about this. Did it produce improvement in things like reasoning or planning? So just like we always see, people get better at the tasks themselves. So this is the light color gray is the first time they play one of these games, and the dark color gray is the last time they play one of these games. People got to choose for themselves how much they engaged with the games. And so some people played a lot, some people played not very much at all, but pretty much everyone got better at them. It's what we always see. You do something a lot, you get better at it. But then when they had participants take measures of things like reasoning that didn't look like the little games, right? This is this generalization question. You got better at these games that we call a reasoning game. Are you also better at other stuff that doesn't look like, the little games you played, but nonetheless use reasoning? And so the take-home message here, all of these bars are the same, whether it's a group that played the games or a group that didn't do any game training at all. They didn't really see any improvement. They basically saw specificity of learning. People got better at the games. they didn't generally get better at reasoning. Same thing with, so this is visual short-term memory, which is kind of a really important core cognitive capacity. Just, if I kind of give you some visual information, how long can you hold on to it? And how much visual information can you hold on to? Again, really no improvements, even though people got better at the games that were memory games, when they were tested in a different type of regime with things that don't look like the games they played, didn't get any better at it. And so this group actually took a pretty harsh stance. Our results provide no evidence to support the belief that regular use of computerized brain trainers improve general cognitive functioning. My own personal tack is that I think their study does a really good job of showing the particular games that they use don't produce general impact. My personal disposition is that I don't find that surprising. Those are the type of games where you tend to get specific learning. There's work on other things that are commercial products. So some of you may have seen Nintendo Brain Age. This was very popular, maybe less so now, but pretty popular, say a decade ago, or maybe even more now. So researchers asked, well, is this Brain Age game, does it produce any benefit that's bigger than, say, just Super Mario Brothers? And the answer there was not really. So this is improvement in kind of attentional abilities, another kind of core cognitive capacity. That comes from playing either the brain training game, it's the blue bar, just Mario Brothers, some type of paper and pencil games, the yellow bar, or the kind of gray is just the control. They didn't do anything at all. And really, in practice, the brain training game didn't lead to bigger effects than any of these. In some cases, the effects are actually smaller than something like just Mario Brothers, led to a bigger impact. And so there's a decent amount of counter evidence with respect to, say, Nintendo Brain Age. And so this is not actually Nintendo Brain Age. I think I mislabeled this slide, but this is actually another study done by a group in England. And what they did is they actually just did an enormous survey. I forgot how many participants they had, but it was into the thousands. And these are people who were kind of regularly engaging with various brain training products. They basically did a survey. Do you engage with any of a big list of brain training products regularly? And then what they did is they measured their cognitive function right then. And then they asked, well, all right, based on how much training you've done, is there any bang for your buck? The expectation is, well, if someone has been training for 60 months, it's 5 years. If these products are super efficacious, well, they should have better memory performance than someone who, say, just started with these games, people who are, say, at 0. And so these black lines are all basically flat, suggesting that the people who had been engaging with these products for 3-4 years weren't really any better at measures of memory or reasoning or verbal performance than the people who had, say, just started or who had never engaged in those. So that's kind of another counterpoint of evidence. There's certainly issues with this type of study. Usually the people who are engaging with these products for long periods of time are not a random sample. Often they're people who think that their cognitive abilities are at risk. And so there's certainly weaknesses in this type of study as well. So, there's evidence, counter evidence to the counter evidence, for sure. And so given this all, where does it leave us? So I would say, that there is kind of reason for optimism, but far transfer is still the most elusive. So this is yet another meta-analysis. It's one that I like. It's on kind of working memory and what we call executive control. This is things like the ability to kind of plan and to ignore distractions. And so on this particular graph, they separate between what they call kind of near transfer. So, they train on whatever the cognitive training intervention is, and then they're tested on things that are not identical, but pretty similar. So that we would call near transfer. And And they're also trained on things that are very not like the training. We would call that bar transfer. And generally speaking, across all of the work in the field, I would say this is pretty much the take-home pattern. People do get better at things that are not exactly the training paradigm, but are, say, somewhat similar to it, this near transfer. That's always a pretty big effect. The far transfer, where you do this kind of training on these products, and then you're better at all other kinds of things, even if it doesn't look at all like your training, that's still more elusive. Those effects are always smaller, and still kind of an obstacle that we're working out how to overcome. Remembering though that not all so, what type of advice do I give? Well, remembering that not all training programs are equal, I would say it's very much the case that not only are the experiences not equal, kind of the scientific predisposition of the various companies are not equal. Some of them are incredibly good actors in the space. They do what I think of as really good science, trying to show the efficacy of their products. Some companies do a much worse job of that. And so things to look for, I know, for instance, my parents, they would go to the websites and they'd say, oh, they have a research page, right? That shows the different scientific papers about, their research. And so not to pick on Lumosity, this was a page though from Lumosity's website, their peer-reviewed published papers. And so one thing that's notable is oftentimes companies will put peer-reviewed published papers that aren't exactly on their product. They're, say, on related products, or they're on related topics. So this particular paper, Evidence for Age-Associated Cognitive Decline from Internet Game Scores. This paper is explicitly about showing that you can measure cognitive decline by looking at performance on the tasks. It doesn't show that the tasks are improving cognitive performance. And so it really puts consumers at a disadvantage in that basically it makes them kind of read through scientific papers, which is a big ask for sure. What are some things beyond cognitive training? So, my personal disposition, what are the things that generally enhance cognitive function? So my personal disposition are things like, some of the apps can certainly be part of what I would think of as kind of a healthy cognitive diet. I think putting demands on the cognitive system, basically, making you work your memory, work your speed of processing, globally useful. Things that are particularly useful is having variety of experience. So not just doing the same thing over and over again. If you do Sudoku every single day, you will get very good at Sudoku. But Sudoku can be solved by some pretty simple heuristics. At some point, you're basically learning how to get good at Sudoku, not good at planning. And so trying out lots of different things. So for instance, I tend to send my parents lots of little games to play, and tell them to play it for, say, a week or so. Really, it's the kind of learning how to play and be challenged by the initial that's particularly useful. Oftentimes we know that there's load on the cognitive system when we're still getting better, right? We still haven't resolved all the load on our cognitive system. What are other things, especially in older populations? Social experience. Social experience is incredibly important for cognitive health. There's lots of work suggesting that certain types of social experience basically is a basic psychological need. And if those needs aren't fulfilled, kind of all of our mental functions are damaged by that. And so in older adults in particular, one common predictor is just hearing ability. Oftentimes when people's hearing becomes worse, they tend to withdraw from social environments. And so huge advice that I give for older populations is if you need a hearing aid, you should get one. I really harped on this with my mother and my father. My father was in a band in his youth. And my mother used to travel around with that band. And so neither of them actually had particularly good hearing. They really damaged their hearing during that time. So I was very adamant that they get a hearing aid because both of them, it started withdrawing from social environments because it was just hard to hear. If they were in a restaurant, they couldn't hear what people were saying. So they tended not to go to restaurants. It's actually pretty important for cognitive health is social interactions. Next is aerobic and cardiovascular health. So just basic aerobic heart health, is tightly linked with cognitive health. And there's lots of reasons why that's true. Kind of having a healthier cardiovascular system is necessarily going to promote brain health. Obviously, the brain, like every other organ, is dependent on the cardiovascular system for bringing oxygenated blood, for removing waste. And so having a better cardiovascular system is going to make for a healthier brain. And so there's lots and lots of work suggesting, that there's benefit to, say, doing, say in older adults, a walking regimen. Doesn't necessarily have to be, playing basketball. But just walking every day can be really beneficial to cognitive health. So this is an example. An exercise in this case, I think, was literally walking. It wasn't something particularly demanding. And in this vein, again, I think variety is important, and there's increasing work asking whether we can link these things. I know this is, the interest in lots of video games, particularly some of the more active ones, is, say, trying to link some activity with a video game so that you're getting all of the benefits. So for instance, there's some games that are made to be played, while walking around, right? You use your phone and it's augmented reality. So you kind of walk around. So you get both the game component, the cognitive component, and the aerobic component. There's some other effects that are useful to consider. So for instance, education seems to have a really protective influence on cognitive decline. So the y-axis here is a standard clinical measure of cognitive function. So lower is worse performance. And the three lines are just different levels of education. And so in particular, lower levels of education are often associated with more significant cognitive decline. And there's kind of a reciprocal relationship that goes on. Often people who have higher levels of education are engaging with more cognitive function or more cognitively demanding activities. And then that is itself useful. And so the last one, that I think also speaks to this point is just things like the impact of retirement. So often when people hit retirement, the level of, say, social engagement goes down, the level of physical engagement goes down, the level of cognitive engagement goes down. And all of those things together will tend to conspire to kind of reduce cognitive abilities. And so it's, really important, again, something I've emphasized for my own parents who are retired, that they need to stay mentally active, play games with each other, play games with me, read difficult things. So, they have subscriptions to various, news magazines like, Wired or The Atlantic, things that are kind of challenging to read through and to have comprehension, to stay physically engaged. So, walking, exercising, and to stay socially engaged. Those are things that often trail off a little bit when people retire. And that can often be a really big disjunction point for cognitive health. So that is it for me today. So I really appreciate your attention, and I'll be kind of looking through questions here. It's my contact information. Just a reminder about the Wisconsin Science Festival, which is obviously ongoing. Today's the first day of it, so this is part of that. And also just a big thank you to Badger Talks. As I said, when I moved to Wisconsin, and I kind of loved Wisconsin as soon as I moved here. And the university, I just really resonated with the Wisconsin idea. I really have always felt that one reason I do science is to kind of better the lives of people around me. And so I really appreciate the opportunities that the University of Wisconsin provides to get to do, talks in various places and try to kind of disseminate the things that we're doing in the lab at UW, kind of better the lives of the folks in Wisconsin. So thank you for that. And happy to take questions here. I'll check the chat. So first one is suggestions for trying to learn a new language. So learning new languages is amongst the more difficult new things to learn. So languages are subject to what we call critical or sensitive periods. So this is basically a period in development early in life, where the brain is super, super receptive to some kinds of input. So for instance, language input. And so, kids are incredibly good at learning languages. So for instance, kids that are raised bilingual basically pick up the two languages incredibly, incredibly well. Once people reach adulthood, learning languages is just much, much more difficult. So there are various apps for learning languages. I think there's evidence suggesting that they can be pretty good for, say, learning some basics. Learning some vocabulary, learning basic conjugation, some kind of really basic grammatical rules. To go much beyond that, really one of the things that's important for learning languages is needing to produce the language. And getting feedback about producing the language. And so, for me, for instance, I have a really close collaborator who is in the French part of Switzerland. And so my French, for instance, really didn't progress until it's kind of forced to use the language consistently, or at least I tried to use the language consistently. Often when they heard my very poor American French, they just switched to English. But really producing it, I think, is important. And so things like, say taking classes at MATC or, other places, I know in Madison, lots of our libraries will offer language classes, opportunities to produce the language, because that's one thing that the apps, even though often many of the little apps will have things where you can say it and it'll be automatically recognized, it's just not the same as actually engaging in conversation with language. So next question, what do you think about supplements for enhancing memory, such as Prevagen and Neurivia? So say from the outset, certainly not an expert in supplements. What I know of, lots of the supplements is that they have made claims that go far beyond the evidence for those claims. Actually, I believe if not both of those companies has been sued somewhat repeatedly by governmental agencies for making claims that go beyond the data. So one thing that's kind of difficult is that the supplement market historically hasn't been regulated by the FDA. And so the FDA has pretty strict rules about, what types of evidence is sufficient to make a claim about a health benefit. How does a trial have to be run? Supplements don't really fall under that. And so they can kind of do what they want and say that there's scientific knowledge. I know one of the companies, the scientific evidence that they put forward, I do not myself find compelling. Oftentimes what companies will do is, what would an example be? So they'll basically take lots and lots of measures of cognitive function and hope that one or two of those might show some kind of statistically significant effect. So as an example, let's say if I told you, oh, taking this pill is going to make you better if you flip a quarter at getting heads than tails. And so I'm going to have you take this pill, and then I'm going to have you go to 50 unique places in your house, and I want you to flip the coin 10 times, right? And then let's say, in 2 of those 50 places, you happen to flip it, let's say 9 times heads out of the 10. Say, oh, look at the pill that I gave you increased the ability to flip heads, but just in those 2 locations, right? That for me just isn't compelling scientific evidence. And so, I think that has been the case with lots of the supplement market, is it just hasn't been subject to the types of studies that I would find compelling scientific evidence. I don't think that there's any evidence that they're harmful. I actually think to even be sold as a supplement, they can't be harmful. But I don't think there's great evidence that they're helpful. There's certainly some drugs for people who are kind of having much more significant decline, say Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. But the supplement evidence, I just don't find particularly compelling myself. Next question, is there any type of brain training that might help people in early stages of dementia? So dementia is kind of a problematic catch-all in that, there's lots and lots of disorders, that can be quite different in terms of the etiology, so in terms of the cause, that we label as dementia. And so, where that's just a decrease in cognitive function. And so really in the end, doing the same types of things that keep people cognitively healthy would probably be the recommendation, but there are certainly some forms of dementia, that have just a very clear biological basis, and so won't really be aided by too much that's behavioral in nature, because what's happening has, say, a genetic component to it, or a clear biological component to it. But I think generally speaking, doing things that are kind of engaging, particularly for, so lots of the studies actually showed, some of them were done in people with, say, what we call mild cognitive impairment, which depending on the study, one might call the early stages of dementia. And so there's at least some evidence that in the broader population of people that would meet that label, just being active physically, mentally, socially would have the most positive impact. So yeah, so Stacy from Augusta is telling me no more questions. So I appreciate your attention. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Green. We appreciate your time.